And then, and now I will turn it over to Victor and Amber.
I need to be allowed to share my screen first.
Oh, you think so?
Yeah, so we have to. There you go.
There we go.
Looks good.
Oh, that's the wrong one. Wait. Oh, hold on a second.
I have our version from last night. Need it.
So make sure you're seeing the right thing. Presentation on. Okay, hold on one second. What does this?
I made you a co-host too, if that helps you, just.
Okay.
I just have to reshare because it's. Sorry for the delay. You should have figured this out first.
It wouldn't be Zoom if we didn't have things like this.
There we go. Okay, so everyone can see that now? Good.
Looks good.
So we're just continuing our talk from last week, where we were talking about the whole gut-brain axis in PD. Last time we gave you kind of the background of what the gut-brain axis is and some of the ways it's been linked to PD. This week we wanted to talk about what things are being studied, what things are being tried, if there's anything you could do on your own, what are the scams out there. So just that's a recap of what we did last time. So what are the links between gut health and the brain and how this extended to PD health? That there may be two ways that PD starts, one in the gut or one in the brain. And what this, and the links to synuclein buildup and even synuclein moving between neurons. So today we're going to start by answering some of the questions that came out of last week's discussion. The first one we want to talk about is a question we got, which is one place of origin for PD worse than the other? So like if it starts in the olfactory bulb, is that worse than it starting in the gut? Or do we even know yet? And if you remember from last time, the whole place of origin hypothesis for PD actually came out of the fact that doctors noticed that PD patients started with different symptoms, what we call the prodromal symptoms. And they kind of were able to roughly divide them into two groups. You had the group that like started with the peripheral symptoms like restless, or with the movement symptoms like restless leg and loss of smell, but they didn't have things like constipation or heart murmurs or things like that. Then you had a group that started with things like constipation and murmurs, but didn't have the loss of smell, restless leg, or the brain symptoms yet. Now, one thing that came out of these studies is that the brain first pathway did tend to be more strongly linked to genetic forms, while the gut first tend to be more linked to idiopathic forms, so more likely environmental encounters. Now, the genetic forms of the disease can have younger onset. They can sometimes progress faster or more aggressively, depending on the genes involved. But in the end, both cases, whether it starts in the gut or the brain, they tend to be diagnosed as PD at roughly the same time clinically, and that's when the movement symptoms that are controlled by the nigral neurons start to show up and can be diagnosed. So saying one is worse than the other, we really don't know enough yet to say that. In the end, they're both PD. And there's really only one lab, maybe a couple, looking at this in depth right now. That's led largely by Per Borghammer, who's in Europe. So a lot more of this is coming out right now, but we don't know enough to say is one worse than the other. They're both PD in the end. The next question, I'm actually going to let Amber take this one.
You can just go ahead and put the answers back up. So I just wanted to first at least describe what is gastroparesis and make sure we're all on the same page. So gastro, in this case, meaning stomach, and paresis meaning paralysis. So gastroparesis is just basically stiffening and difficulty moving your stomach. So this can happen for a variety of reasons. It just happens to occur a lot in Parkinson's disease, but even things like diabetes can cause a gastroparesis. So this is not only PD. And it's interesting, looking up the frequency, like how often does this happen in Parkinson's? There are some of the literature cites 100% of patients will have some features of gastroparesis. So some of these symptoms include things like what we call early satiety. So meaning you can get full very fast. So you eat, very small amount and can feel full very quickly. It can be associated with nausea and just feeling unwell. And again, it's really related around mealtime. Typically these symptoms outside of mealtime is just maybe mild nausea. And as far as like when this might show up with Parkinson's, it looks like it can show up at any time. And I think this actually kind of ties into what we were just talking about. So for some people that have a lot of, like their first symptoms are all GI type of symptoms, this is often something that comes with that. So if you're someone who's really prone to having a lot of stomach and GI tract issues, you may also then have gastroparesis. But it really can show up early, it can show up late. There's no way for us to really predict necessarily who's going to have this as a problem. But it's likely that at some point, most people are going to have some issues with gastroparesis if you have PD. Again, that being said, people just as we get older, this can happen as well. So it's not exclusive to Parkinson's. It's not really a good early indicator. This can be a subtle thing that it's not so obvious. It's really when it becomes a big problem and it starts interfering with your ability to actually get enough nutrition in, that it becomes a bigger problem. And that's when I would start referring people to a neurogastroenterologist or a brain gut doctor, because they do exist. So I actually was looking around last night, and UPMC has this new brain gut health program, which I thought was interesting. I listed their link here for their digestive disorders clinic. They actually have like a neuro-specific motility clinic there. And I think with the advent of the Duopa and having the intestinal gel and bringing GI colleagues into the PD community, a lot of these programs are sprouting up just because of that. And I think that's where we started really getting tied into GI at UPMC. But there are similar types of doctors at AHM, and you can see the link here. But yes, I think that if GI issues are a big problem for you, then there should be a neurogastroenterologist on board. But this is not necessary for everybody. Okay, next.
So regarding inflammation, what does it feel like, or how does it present in PD? Like inflammation that can be seen in your sore joints or in wounds, or how do you even know that you have inflammation?
So just defining inflammation, this is really, really basically, this is just your body responding to something that it finds irritating. So it's in a really nondescript way. So a lot of times when we think of inflammation, we think of the obvious stuff like a red, hot, swollen joint. But that's not the only way that inflammation can show up. There is what we call neuroinflammation, so inflammation that occurs in the brain. And this can be silent, meaning it kind of sneaks up and it's quiet. And this is really more likely to happen very slowly over long periods of time. The brain itself can't sense pain. That kind of sounds weird, but if you poke the brain, it won't hurt. And so when you have something that could be irritating in the brain, you don't necessarily, it doesn't show up the same way as it would if you banged your knee. So, the symptoms are just not obvious if there's ongoing inflammation. And again, I think the key thing here is that when we're talking about inflammation with things like Parkinson's, we're talking about really slow things that are occurring over years, if not decades. And I think the other really important thing that I'm not sure we covered very well in the last session is that when we're talking about inflammation, specifically the immune cells that are happening and changing in the brain, there's this constant flux, and it's this balance between being pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory. The brain doesn't have the immune system like the rest of the body does. It's sort of unique in that way. And, so it responds differently. And at the same time, you want there to be immune cells going around the brain and surveying the area. If there's something that looks sick, they should take care of it. And sometimes that means, chewing up and killing that cell and getting it out of the way. And so, it's this balance that needs to be maintained, which is particularly hard in the brain. That being said, too much inflammation or too little inflammation can be bad. And so we're asking a lot of our immune system to try and maintain this balance. It just so happens to be that when we're in a state where it's pro-Parkinson's to develop in the brain, that means that there's probably other factors that are going into this that are sort of perpetuating the process in Parkinson's. And it turns out that, let's say there's a variety of reasons that cause dopamine cells to get sick, but when they are sick, they actually can start making basically chemicals that are released into the surrounding area that can then signal to the immune cells to say, hey, I'm sick, I'm not doing well, there's a problem over here. And that then attracts the immune cells to come in. And that in of itself is actually worsening the inflammation. And so one of the ideas, and I got to say, I've really have been a big believer in this as well, that, the inflammation itself may not be the tipping point that says, okay, we're not Parkinson's pathology to this is now Parkinson's, but it may be really, really important in just the progression. So allowing Parkinson's, the changes happening in the brain, allow it to continue over time. And so, in fact, think of this as like a second hit hypothesis, so that something is really driving the initial pathology, but it's the second hit with the inflammation that's really then driving the progression of Parkinson's over years and years and years. And interestingly, the Fox Foundation is interested in this as well, and they're funding research specifically to look at the second hit hypothesis with inflammation. And so it's really hard to know what's happening in the brain at any given moment with regards to inflammation. There are some types of imaging studies that can be looked at, but this is still early days. I think it's assumed that if you have a diagnosis of Parkinson's enough that you have like really clear symptoms, that there is some degree of inflammation there. And I think the other point I want to make is that this inflammation, this goes across the board for all the neurodegenerative diseases. So Alzheimer's, ALS, and Parkinson's, we believe that this neuroinflammation is a piece of all of this for neurodegeneration.
And do you know if cell-to-cell transmission of abnormal alpha-synuclein can be slowed with exercise? And short answer is, we don't know. No one's really looked at this except in maybe some models in the lab. Theoretically, exercise should impact alpha-synuclein based on what we've seen in the lab and what we know about the biochemistry. Maybe, it can help with improving the clearance of the alpha-synuclein bad forms before they move from cell to cell. maybe they reduce the production of alpha-synuclein through other cell signaling ways, or they can even change how alpha-synuclein is being processed and used. But like I said, all of this has really only been looked at in the lab. We don't really know what's happening in the human body with exercise. So
Yeah, I actually think this is a fascinating question. I really, yeah, big kudos to whoever thought of this. I think it's of interest to the field to know this, but it is really darn hard to study this. We don't actually know how or why synuclein moves in between cells. And just the simple how is still trying to be figured out. But this it makes a lot of sense that this could be an effect. So I imagine we'll have a better sense of figuring this out. I think one of the best ways that will help us the fastest is, there's been a lot of effort to get imaging studies for us to take a look in the brain in someone who's alive and well and moving around, to look specifically at synuclein. I think this is one way it could potentially help us answer that question. But those imaging studies are in the infancy. But I could see this being a great study, actually.
okay, so with those questions answered, oh dear. I have no idea why that's going on. With those questions answered, let's get on with chapter 2. We do understand that there were more questions asked. We addressed the ones that we felt were direct extensions of last time. And if we have time, we'll hit some more questions here at the end of this brief little chapter. So things we want to cover today is how is gut flora linked to PD? So not just the gut-brain axis, but specifically what's going on in the gut and how is that associated with PD? What are some of the treatments that are being researched to change the gut flora? What are the scams? Because like anything else, there are people trying to cheat people. And one question that we did get is, how can I modify my own gut biome? So we tried to address that. So last time we talked about the gut-brain axis being controlled by this vagal nerve and alpha-synuclein misfolding being able to propagate. But what really happens in the gut? How is the gut handling this? And to understand that, you have to understand about what's going on inside the gut. And the gut, your gut, is its own biome. It's its own environment. It is host to billions of types of bacteria and fungi and viruses and other things. And they all need to be there to make our gut work, actually. Our gut is full of microbes. And they aren't just there because, we ate something bad like a truck stop ham sandwich. They're there because we need them to be there. They are responsible for helping digest our food, to help us absorb our vitamins and minerals and amino acids. And their ability to do these things are what helps keep our gut working. They actually make some of the lipids that our gut needs to be intact and healthy, and to keep things moving.
I was going to add, most of your bowel movements are actually made up of the leftovers of the bacteria. I mean, that's just how abundant they are, and how it just shows like how critical they are for our normal digestion.
So, we're not talking about parasites here. We're not talking about tapeworms or roundworms or things like that. Those obviously are problems. Where we're talking about microbes, so bacteria, tiny funguses, lactobacillus and E. coli and things like that, like these are supposed to be there because they chew up the food that our body is not designed to chew up and actually make it into a form that we can absorb and use. The problems, however, that come with the gut arise when these things don't work together in a balance. So like I said, there are millions, if not billions, of types of these microbes, different species of these microbes. And they have to work together in a specific balance to get us a healthy gut. But if somebody overgrows or goes to a spot they're not supposed to be in, the balance gets thrown off whack. And we can have issues with absorption or issues with inflammation in the gut.
I just want to add here, there's this really interesting study looking at babies who are just born, and they technically have no flora in their gut when they're born. But as soon as they have that first drink of milk, when they're, you know, just out of the womb, that's their very first dose of flora. And so, in fact, it turns out that you can identify who your parents are just based off of your flora, because they actually should match your mom and dad as well. And so you inherit some of this, interestingly.
So what do I say when I mean things become unbalanced? Well, as we all know, there are specific infections that can happen to the gut that can make things really, really bad, really, really fast. So acute infections of things like C. diff, or bad forms of E. coli or salmonella. They're things that suddenly, you know, you're fine one day, the next day you've got diarrhea, you're in the hospital, you're getting massive antibiotics. Obviously, these are really bad things that cause massive inflammation, massive upset of your gut flora. These require immediate treatment so that you don't die or have major damage to your intestinal tract. But this is not what I'm talking about. These would be infections. What I'm talking about is imbalances of your normal gut microbiota. So these are things that can go largely unnoticed and can lead to long-term issues like inflammation, like obesity, like leaky gut. And I use the term leaky gut. I actually don't like the term leaky gut because, one, it gets overused and people get this idea of, oh, there's actually holes in my gut and chunks of food and, you know, everything else are coming through. That's not what leaky gut means. Leaky gut is kind of tied to inflammation in the fact that what it means is your gut is not as good at filtering out what it should and shouldn't absorb. And so molecules that normally wouldn't get through because of inflammation are now getting through and actually exacerbating inflammation or letting in minerals that we don't need. And so this can lead to other things down the road. And any of these things could even be the trigger for alpha-synuclein misfolding. We don't know that, but that is the hypothesis when it comes to how gut flora are influencing gut inflammation and gut dysfunction that leads to this gut-brain axis. So this is where we study the link. This is where we think the problem starts, is in how your gut flora are organized. Oh, I don't know why it's half working. And this has been tied to many chronic diseases. I already mentioned obesity. There are other digestive diseases, IBS, that it may be tied to, but also neurological disorders like Alzheimer's disease, like Parkinson's disease, like MSA, SMA. All these things may be tied to, in some part, not necessarily fully, but in some part, how healthy the gut is. So, oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I mean, there's this link with the LRRK2 mutations and like IBS, for example. So I think we're just scratching the surface right now of, you know, this real connection with these other neurodegenerative diseases. But I mean, very clearly, this is I think that it's really Parkinson's where this has been making the most headway.
Yeah, I mean, and when we say we're scratching the surface, I mean, for decades of research on all these brain diseases, Parkinson's in particular, we weren't even thinking about the gut. We knew constipation was a symptom of PD, but we really didn't understand why, and we never thought of it as being a precursor to PD rather than, or a source of PD rather than just an associated symptom. Because we know there's dopamine neurons in the gut. Dopamine goes down everywhere. But now we have this thinking of it may actually be starting there or may actually be made worse because of how the gut is functioning. And, you know, we're just starting to scratch the surface on this and other diseases that are attached to the gut. And so, and when I say just starting to scratch the surface, this is a very, very in-depth called a meta-analysis. It actually took the data from a bunch of other studies that have been looking at gut flora in PD patients as compared to healthy control patients. This was just published last month and is so far one of the best reviews for kind of consolidating all the data that's out there, processing it in a way that is meaningful, and spitting back out something that's reliable. Because when you look at all the other studies individually, the data is kind of all over the place. And this study tried to make sense of that. And I'm not going to go into depth of what this paper says, because we could spend several of these sessions discussing just what this paper says. But the basic takeaways from this paper are that there is tons of evidence out there, even studies that this paper didn't look at, that there's clearly a significant imbalance, a significant difference between the balance of gut in the PD patient gut and the balance of bacteria in a healthy gut. They're clearly different. And when I say there's a different balance, I'm not saying that there's good bacteria versus bad bacteria. In both cases, they're all bacteria that should be there. And what's even stranger is that some of the bacteria that seem to be really, really high in PD patients as compared to controls are bacteria that we thought were very, very beneficial. They're the bacteria that you find in probiotic drinks and supplements. And they're actually already higher in PD patients. So it's about the balance. It's not about this bacteria is good and this bacteria is bad. They're all bacteria that we actually need to have. And if you look through this paper, there's literally hundreds of species of bacteria that they find different in different amounts between healthy and PD patients, but they're found in both. They're found in healthy people and they're found in PD. They're just at different levels. So one thing that tends to happen is the bacteria that are really common in PD patients tend to be very rare in healthy. The bacteria that are really common and healthy tend to be very rare in PD patients. So again, I'm not going to go into the details of them because there's literally dozens and dozens of species that they cover. But the question that comes out of this, the thing that we need to understand, and the reason I'm not going into the detail of it, is because this does not answer the question of, did the gut imbalance cause the PD, or did the PD cause the gut imbalance? Did already having Parkinson's disease create an environment in the gut where this imbalance was allowed to happen? And just not being able to answer that question means we still don't know enough yet about how do we direct the gut to fix this, or if it's even the root problem.
Yeah.
That said, we are starting to get a lot of evidence that rebalancing the gut, or making the gut microbiome look more like a healthy person's, can improve PD symptoms. And I'm not just saying constipation. There's evidence that it's helping movement and non-movement symptoms beyond the gut. And this is really, really exciting data. It's in its infancy, but it's really, really exciting. One trial that's been tried several times now and has been really successful in the lab is this idea of just flat out cold turkey reset the gut. It's almost kind of like going back to that baby step and then repopulating the gut. So that's tested this hypothesis that if you can just wipe out all the bad population, just wipe out your gut bacteria, it will reset to a healthy balance. And the way this is done is by using a antibiotic that can't be absorbed by your gut. So it doesn't go into your body and affect bacteria anywhere else in your system. It just wipes out your gut bacteria. An antibiotic called rifaximin that's often used for gut infections. And then these studies have been looking at the motor outcomes and the non-motor symptom outcomes. While it has worked well in the lab, unfortunately, the trials have been kind of all over the place. And the most recently completed trial was completely inconclusive. There were clearly problems with how the antibiotic was being utilized, really tiny number of patients. So not a lot of good to say about this yet, but enough good comes out of the lab that they're still trying it. So a new trial is just started up. It's currently recruiting. We'll keep you posted on that. But something that's surprisingly fascinating are these ideas of resetting the gut flora by using fecal transplants. So a trial was very recently completed. Again, paper data from this just published last month on a trial that was just completed a few months ago. It was a pilot study, so a handful of PD patients were given a fecal transplant from healthy patients, and then those patients, their healthy family members, and then a population of PD patients that did not receive a transplant were all followed for only 6 months. So very small study, very short time scale. The samples were so healthy samples were transplanted from donors, control donors, and those were put into PD patients. The idea was that the healthy balance would overwhelm and supplant the patient's own gut microbiome. And the patients, this was mainly a safety study, so it was a phase 2 study, but the patients, so not only was it safe, the patient showed significantly improved movement scores, non-motor scores, and constipation scores at just the 6-month follow-up. And in some cases, even double-digit drops in scores were recorded, with the drop in score being a good thing for a lot of the PD assessments. Again, I want to emphasize this was a small trial, and while it has really encouraging results, this trial was, it was not done here in the US. This trial was done in Israel on a very small scale, but it's promising enough that several other trials have been started up all over the world. There's trials in China and Finland that are currently recruiting, and one at the University of Texas, Houston, that has just finished recruiting and is currently ongoing. So it'll be very exciting to see how they stack up against the already published trial.
To me, this just says like how big of an idea this is becoming. You know, and I think it shows that there's, I'm hoping we'll see a lot of good data coming out of these kinds of studies here soon.
Now, important, it's a good thing the interest is there. Now, an important caveat with this, in addition to saying it's a small study, we don't know a lot, again, it's not answering the question of why. We're just seeing an effect, but we don't know why. Now, this could be as simple as changing the gut biome means the patients are able to absorb their medicine better. And that's why we're seeing improvements in all these scores. Now, that's not a bad thing, but it may not be changing the course of the disease. So we need more work. We need to see what's really happening here. But the fact that there's an effect is very promising. So now let's go to the other end of the scale. And that's where like Dr. Amber said, there's a lot of interest in this. And wherever there's interest in something, there's someone trying to make a buck off of it. And so I urge you to use your best judgment. And if something sounds too good to be true, as usual, it probably is. So I'm going to repeat, we do not know enough yet in the clinic to say, take this supplement, it'll fix your gut, because we don't know what the right balance is. And we don't know how to change your balance. Like we don't have a pill that will get rid of the bacteria that are high in PD and put in the ones that are high in control. And even if we did, we don't know if that's the right way to do this. That hasn't stopped a bunch of people on the internet from trying to sell you something that will, or at least that they say will, treat and cure your PD. There's even a program out there for gut-brain hypnotherapy to fix your leaky gut by the power of the mind. Not saying it doesn't work, just saying I have no idea what the science behind this is. But that said, there are several companies out there that look completely legitimate. One off the top of my head is called Viome. They offer a test just like 23andMe. You take home, you send them some fecal sample, they do a custom assessment of what your gut microbiome is. Now, first off, I want to say you can't really do a good gut microbiome from a home test. You probably need to get deeper in the gut, like with a colonoscopy. So right there is a problem with these home test kits. And then they will take this data and custom design a probiotic treatment just for you to fix your gut. It's not clear how they're doing this, what their scientific methods are. They're clearly getting the gut biome sample from the wrong place to do a assessment that would actually be beneficial to you. And I want to emphasize, the best study on what PD gut biome looks like compared to control was just published last month. So where is this company getting their science from? It probably is not in your best interest to trust them or to put much value in them. Just use your best judgment when it comes to these kind of things. And as always, talk to your doctor. So that brings up the biggest question you probably have right now. Is there anything you can do or should do to take care of your gut flora? Since our understanding of what's the correct bacteria is still early, there's not a lot we can say here, especially given that some of the bacteria levels that, like bacteria that we probably would have suggested take these, are not only already in the PD gut, but they're actually higher in the PD gut. So is that a problem or is it a symptom? We don't know. What we do know, what we do understand is that a proper balance seems to be the key. And the healthy gut does look different than PD gut. We're still working and trying to figure out what makes the right equilibrium, what brings your gut into balance to make things work right. We're still trying to understand that. The one thing we can say with confidence is that we know that a healthy diet is still considered the best way by doctors, by nutritionists, to maintain a healthy gut. And when we say that, we're talking about eat your fruits and veggies, eat your fiber, avoid red meats, avoid processed meats, those kind of things. That said, fiber can have other issues when it comes to medicines, and Amber will talk about this. You wanted to mention
But I
something?
mean, at the end of the day, it's the stuff that you know about. I mean, exercise and the good diet and water, just moving around, and having enough fiber and, enough of these things to make sure things are working well. I mean, the healthy diet and just the healthy living, I mean, these are really the best ways to, keep a balanced microbiome. And as we learn more, maybe recommendations will change. But I think for, a lot of other reasons, just, from a Parkinson's standpoint in the brain, there's just a lot of reasons to maintain just a good, healthy diet, high in fruits and vegetables, and again, water, move around. These are all ways to help with the gut.
And as always, talk to your doctor before making any radical changes. If you've eaten the same meal for dinner for the last 25 years, make sure it's okay that you just suddenly switch to salads and never eat that food again. Because if you do that and suddenly feel bad, it may be other reasons. So, and before you start taking any kind of supplement, because again, supplements are drugs. Make sure you talk to your doctor.
Yeah.
So with that, there were some more questions that came out last week that actually are more tied to what we talked about today. So we moved them to the end of the presentation. Or that we just thought were really, really interesting questions that we wanted to answer. One that I really liked and I thought was very interesting. Doesn't have as much to do with the gut, but does have a little bit to do when it comes to that brain first versus gut first. Like particularly people that lose their sense of smell very, very early on, and that's their first symptom. So it may be a very simple question to ask. Why doesn't dopamine replacement put the sense of smell back when it can fix movement and gut and other things? And that has to do with the difference in how the movement system and the gut system are wired compared to the smell system. When it comes to movement in the brain, the nigral neurons, the ones that are lost, the ones that cause the movement symptoms that usually lead to the diagnosis of PD, the way they normally work is they go from the substantia nigra up to the striatum, and they just completely surround the striatal neurons. This is the output of just 2 axons of a dopamine neuron. Now imagine thousands of those dopamine neurons, hundreds or thousands of them, with this same coverage. One way to think about it is like you're filling and they just bathe this area in dopamine. The replacement works because even if you lose one of these axons, the other one has a lot of overlap in coverage. It just makes it pump out twice as much dopamine and you can get some of that function back. One way to think about it is, imagine you're filling your swimming pool with 2 hoses, and one of the hoses gets a kink in it, doesn't work anymore. Well, just make more water come out of the other hose and you can go back to filling your swimming pool the same way. Smell doesn't work like that. Smell is a much, much more complicated system. So there are dopamine neurons that exist in the olfactory bulb, but their purpose there is to tightly regulate how the signals pass between the olfactory receptors, the smell neurons in your nose, and the neurons that go into the brain and register that smell. When that dopamine neuron dies, the circuit between that smell neuron and the brain neuron gets scrambled. And the reason this is a problem is because each smell neuron is responsible for one smell. You have millions of these neurons in your nose, and each one only picks up one of 400 different smells. So when you lose this neuron that's connected to this smell receptor and this projection, you've lost that circuit. It's completely scrambled. And no amount of putting dopamine back is going to fix it because there's no neuron there to use the dopamine. There's no connection. Once it's gone, that circuit is scrambled, that smell is gone. And that's why we can't put sense of smell back, because we've actually messed up the circuitry.
I just want to add, you smell things by getting input from a bunch of different neurons. And so the complexity of smell is definitely something that diminishes over time. So it's just kind of keep that in mind. Yes, you're losing that one sensory sense, let's say, but in order for us to just smell on a normal basis, it requires like all of that to work together so that you can smell chocolate.
I did actually simplify this down. So it's not just dopamine neurons that are in the olfactory bulb. There's actually dopamine neurons from your substantia nigra, from your striatum, that also project to the olfactory bulb and regulate this. So losing any of those really diminishes the complexity of your ability to smell. And once that connection's gone, I mean, the whole connection's gone. It's not like the striatum where you just got this fiber mesh. It's one connection. And when it's gone, you've lost that regulation, you've lost that complexity, and we can't put it back if the neuron's not there. Okay, next. I'm gonna let you take this one. What's the
like?
Is it an early indicator? Is there a way to avoid getting the crashes after eating?
This is a very fancy word. So postprandial hypotension. Basically, the idea here is that you eat, and what normally happens is your stomach's now full of food. And in order to digest the food, the blood goes rushing to your stomach to help, help with digestion, help clear the nutrients out, so you can start absorbing as early as in the stomach. This is, for example, why they tell you not to swim after you've had a meal for like 20 minutes, because you want to, all the blood is being shunted to your stomach to help with digestion. So sometimes what that means is that when your blood is all going to the stomach, that means it's not going to your toes, it's not going to your brain. And that means that some people, when they eat, so after they've eaten, they will have hypotension, so drops in their blood pressure, meaning the blood's just not going to all the places it needs to go. Often this is felt as dizziness, lightheadedness, confusion, just feeling off, fuzzy headed. And for some people can be really severe, so that they actually pass out after they eat. So the blood pressure drops so much that they actually lose consciousness. That's rare, but this is what postprandial hypotension is. So that after eating, drops in blood pressure. It's not really an early indicator per se. I do say that, having seen somebody come into clinic and that's their only symptom, I'm like, there's probably something else going on, depending on the rest of the clinical picture. I would be looking for something like PD to be there, but in of itself isn't a diagnostic for Parkinson's. It turns out actually a lot of people as we get older, this happens very frequently. In a lot of cases, it's actually silent. It's happening, but not to such an extent that you can feel it. And so you just don't even know it's there. And so there's actually some sources that say this is more common than what we call the orthostatic hypotension. So the drops in blood pressure when you stand up or change position. It's just that can be more subtle. So again, it just happens as we get older. It can be way more pronounced though in patients with Parkinson's. And that's part of why this is a feature that we get to talk about in this group. So there are a few ways to help with the crashes, so this big drop in blood pressure. And in fact, these are very identical to what I would recommend for someone who had orthostatic hypotension, or meaning that the drops of blood pressure when they stand up too fast. So a lot of this is you can't eat 3 big meals a day. That this is like the best way to bring these crashes on. Because again, the whole point here is that the blood's rushing to the stomach. And so you want to try to avoid that by eating smaller amounts of food. This sometimes ties into the gastroparesis, or that the stomach paralysis, let's say. And in that case too, it helps to eat smaller more frequently. It turns out that if you have lower carbohydrate meals, this seems to help as well. When you're eating a big heavy meal with lots of fat and protein in it, sometimes that changes the way that the blood is being shunted. So they also recommend lower carbohydrate meals. In fact, the most beneficial tip that I could find was actually exercising. So even if it's just a mild walk, this actually seems to be one of the better ways to help avoid a crash. What's happening is when you're moving around, you're affecting your blood pressure. And by having the demand from your muscles, it's actually forcing some of that blood to go away from the stomach and into your muscles as you're moving around and trying to walk. And so, in fact, the recommendation is just keep moving. If you know it's coming, get up, start walking, or do something to move around, to pull that blood away from the stomach and other parts of your body. But keep in mind, there are other things, so to just not make it worse. So you might need to adjust other blood pressure medicines that are used to like lower blood pressure. Maybe you just don't need as much, or you change when you take them, for example. Things like alcohol too can interfere. So it's all these little tricks to make it not so bad. Okay, celiac disease. I see we're running out of time. Go back.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So this is an interesting question. And this has actually come up for me in clinic a couple of times. And there's like true celiac disease, and then there's the gluten sensitivity. I'm kind of lumping them together in this here. Anecdotally, I have patients who swear that they feel better when they're on a gluten-free diet. Yet when we look at the evidence, and they've actually gone in and tried to really look at this very rigorously, the evidence just really isn't strong that this is a great way to go for Parkinson's or not. If you do not have like real celiac disease, a gluten-free diet helping PD doesn't seem to be there. That being said, if you feel better, my goodness, yeah, go gluten-free. It just happens to be very hard to do that. Now, there's been, again, we were talking again, is there a link between like gut issues and Parkinson's? And again, there is like a sort of a loose link between some of the genetic mutations, like this LRRK2 mutation I mentioned, and things like IBS. But people have been looking at this for celiac disease as well. And does not seem to be a good link there. They actually did this really large study in Europe, looking at these national health systems where they have tens of thousands of people, and there did not seem to be a link with PD specifically. Now, that being said, in celiac disease, your immune system's actually attacking your gut. And in fact, it is actually damaging or killing off parts of the gut that are there to absorb water and nutrients and things like this from the gut. And so there's a good reason to think that it would affect absorption of our medications. We don't really know. It's funny that the literature is just not really there. There's very little for us to understand, not just Parkinson's meds, but any medication and how this might be absorbed with celiac disease. You know, and as little as we know with what's happening with all the meds, it's even less well understood what's happening with Parkinson's meds. I think it's just not that big of a surprise to think that if you're directly, you know, damaging the parts of the body that are meant to absorb things, it might have a problem here too. So, you know, I would say it's potentially an issue here for this particular person asking this question. But the other thing to think about is sometimes this means the gut is just not moving as well. And sometimes that can affect the way that medications are absorbed as well. And again, ultimately, if this is like true celiac disease, the best way to treat this is a true gluten-free diet, which is incredibly hard to do. Yeah, I think that's all I had to say about celiac.
Okay, and that's what we had for today. So we are very rapidly running out of time. The one thing I wanted to add to the end was, while Amber and I still have plenty of ideas for these wonderful Fridays, we can always use more. So if we put the question to you, if there are topics that we haven't covered so far or that you would like to hear more about, let Christine know or let us know, and we will try to work them into future presentations. We could spend whole sessions just answering people's questions too. So if you have questions, please send those in.
There was a question about PD, the generation. I just responded to that in the chat. We could do sessions just on genetics. I know Christine and I talked about doing something just on meds. That's another topic we can bring up. There were some medication questions that came in. I'd like to reserve them for something like that.
Yeah, I think that discussion was kind of reviewing the classes themselves and within classes, which I think would be extremely helpful for our folks because there's just so much out there.
There is, and it's a good thing because like not that long ago we had very little to pick from. So I'm glad there's some variety.
May I ask one question? I was listening to this wonderful discussion of fecal transplants, and you know the effect, but you don't know the why, which is